Today at Petrochemical Strategies, storms of the century. As the U.S. chemical industry recovers from the latest winter storm crisis, it's probably a good time to ask, what can we learn from this? It's the 10th day of March in the year 2021. It has been about 40 months since Hurricane Harvey hit the U.S. Gulf Coast. That was the wettest and most costly storm, with approximately $125 billion worth of damages caused by that storm. In addition, it took about 300,000 tons of ethylene production out of the market because 17 crackers had to shut down and others had to slow down rates. I thought that was the storm of the century until Winter Storm Uri arrived. In a moment, I am going to talk to Victoria Meyer. She is the president of Progressio Global, a consulting firm that helps chemical companies accelerate success by closing the gap between strategy and execution. As an executive at Shell and Clariant, Victoria delivered growth and transformation across multi-million-dollar businesses. Today, she helps clients deliver transformational results at the intersection of strategy, marketing, and execution. Recently, I came across an article she wrote titled 4 Strategic Actions Following the U.S. Gulf Coast Winter Storm Crisis, which prompted me to ask her to share her thoughts on what we can learn. Before we get to that, let me show you some images I found off of NASA's website. This first image compares the satellite photos of Houston on February 7th before the storm and on February 16th during the storm. As you can see, there were significant power outages throughout the greater Houston area. At the peak of the outages, an estimated 1.4 million Houstonians were without electricity. The second image comes from the Goddard Earth Observing System, which measures the air temperatures at a level of 2 meters above the Earth's surface. As you can see, there are areas in Texas that were colder than Maine and even Alaska. Let's turn now to my conversation with Victoria. Hello, Victoria. Before we get started, I want to ask you, did you make it through the U.S. Gulf Coast winter storm all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel very fortunate that we had minimal impact, unlike a lot of our neighbors and, of course, people across the region.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that you made it through the storm okay. I also noticed that you recently posted a blog on your website called 4 Strategic Actions Following the U.S. Gulf Coast Winter Storm Crisis. You started off talking about risk management in the blog, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this topic as it relates to the U.S. Gulf Coast winter storm and generally to the petrochemicals industry.
Yeah, so, it's been interesting because a number of people would say, we're just not designed for this, whether it be houses or when we think about our petrochemical plants and here in the South, that they're not designed for these cold weathers. And yet we know that in many other very cold regions, these plants operate safely and effectively through very harsh conditions. And it's really a decision around risk and risk assessment and risk management. So, when you think about this, people will identify what that risk is, in this case, a freeze-related risk, what the frequency is, what the likelihood of impact is, and then decide to either accept that as a risk that the plants would freeze or to mitigate it. And then there's a decision on how to mitigate it, and there's always costs associated with it. So clearly there has been a decision across the industry that the risk from freeze and from a catastrophic freeze like we experienced is low, and they chose not to mitigate it to a great degree.
Well, that leads nicely into my next question about supply chain and safety stock. What should the industry have learned from this short-term crisis, like this winter storm we went through that basically shut down Texas for a number of days? And more generally, how will the industry change its views on supply chain and safety stock as we recover from the pandemic?
Yeah. So what's interesting is, safety stock and supply chain it's always a tricky issue. There's a lot of this has to do with economics, right? So nobody wants to hold a lot of safety stock in their system and their supply chain because it's working capital. It has an economic impact. And yet, again, when I look at what happens from a hurricane perspective, companies plan really effectively for that, right? So they understand what their requirements are within their supply chain. They boost their safety stock. What we've got going on right now is a confluence event. So safety stocks had diminished during COVID as companies slowed down their production and then have not been able to catch back up with what demand is. In many cases, at year end, companies reduce their safety stock levels and what they have in their supply chain because of working capital and what looks like on their financials at year end. And then here we have the freeze. So, there's an opportunity again to ties it back to risk management, reassess what those supply chain strategies are. How many suppliers do you have? This applies both to producers and to their customers. What's the appropriate safety stock? Does it vary by season? When you think about seasonality in winter, will you think differently about it next year? It's really an opportunity to reassess, reevaluate, and plan more effectively. I think we're going to see a bit more robustness going forward, certainly in the winter, than what we've seen this winter as companies plan for future potential outages.
We know that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the olefins and polyolefins industry was affected by the storm here in the US. These facilities lost power, and utilities like instrument air and obviously natural gas was a big issue. And there were reports that several chemical facilities had to shut down under pretty dire conditions. So what do you think these companies could have done better to prepare for these extraordinary events?
That's a really hard one because I would say nobody truly anticipates the confluence of events that occurred. Yeah. So, I look at this winter freeze very much like I look at the hurricanes. So when we think about hurricane season and when there's big storms off the Gulf coming in, the chemical companies have a really good system in place in terms of monitoring conditions, having staged decision making and staged shutdowns as needed to prepare for this. The opportunity is same here. Earlier indications about what the impact of events is, more warning systems, right? So understanding what the potential power impact is, the nat gas impact is, the freeze impact is on their assets, and then it goes back to risk management as we were talking about in the first place. What's the plan that's going to be in place? How are you going to mitigate and prepare for freezing conditions? And being able to make better decisions in the future when we have, whether it be a freeze or another weather-related incident.
So Victoria, I really liked how you wrapped up your blog talking about being a good neighbor. Maybe you can tell us exactly what you meant by that.
Yeah. So there's when we look at what happened in the freeze in our local communities, there was a lot of cooperation across people helping fix busted pipes, et cetera. When we look at what goes on in the chemical industry, same thing, right? So some great stories coming out of this that even while the chemical assets were not operating, companies were keeping their cogen running and putting power back into the grid. There was companies providing potable water and drinking water to their local communities to support people who didn't have access to water. So a lot of great, good neighborly support of the communities. And on a broader basis, the chemical industry has a history of great cooperation, certainly as we think about emergency response and shared response networks. There's an opportunity to look a little bit further when we think about these weather-related incidents or frankly, any other crises that may come along. How do we cooperate across plants and companies? How do we cooperate and support communities better that our people live in, our employees, our customers, and just the community that supports our facilities? So a lot of great examples of cooperation and being good neighbors, and a continued opportunity to look for more ways to continue to do so.
That's a great message. I want to wrap up by asking you, what do you think Progressio Global can do to help the largest and most sophisticated chemical companies recover from events like this and actually plan ahead for major unforeseen events?
Yeah, so our focus at Progressio is really helping chemical companies and executives close the gap between strategy and execution. And so, we think about things like this around risk assessment and supply chain. It's really going in and helping these companies identify where are the gaps. So there's obviously a goal to not shut down or to manage these risks more effectively. What are the gaps in closing that? We come in, we help assess that. We talk to employees, we talk to customers to help identify where those gaps and opportunities are and put together a plan of action to make really quick response in moving results forward, accelerating results, and closing those gaps. And that's what we do each and every day.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Victoria, for your time today. It was certainly nice to read the article that you wrote, 4 Strategic Actions Following the U.S. Gulf Coast Winter Storm Crisis. And I encourage everybody who's watching this to actually read the blog as well. And it was great to hear your thoughts on those topics. Thank you very much, Victoria.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate the opportunity and enjoy talking with you today.
The chemical industry is going to take some time to recover from this winter storm. There's broken pipes to fix and busted equipment, and also a broken supply chain caused by numerous declarations of force majeure. But there is one thing we can learn from this. Don't waste a good crisis. Learn from it.